What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 157 of Nintendo Noise, Slipscreen Games' weekly Nintendo podcast. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined today by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Steven Radford.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Steve. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's good to be back, talking about one of Pete's favorite topics, Pokemon.
Yeah, and one of the Internet's favorite topics, Palworld, right? Because it feels like the story that's been, I guess, 9 months in the making here, right? Because obviously it was earlier this year, Palworld launched, made a ton of headlines for, breaking records on Steam and, got a lot of love from players all over the world. And of course, also a lot of conversation about the obvious similarities between it and the franchise that inspired it, Pokemon, but the more serious allegations that there was some, potential copyright infringement, right? That they were,
that was around the characters, though, right? That was all about
and animations.
Very familiar. Potentially, the 3D models have been stolen from
with like
straight out of Sun and Moon, and then modified to have like a bit of a Palworld skin on it.
Correct. And then now, there was even a statement from Nintendo and the Pokemon Company back then that they were looking at the game and that, if they had assessed that there was copyright infringement, that, they would seek legal action at that time. And it seemed like, a kind of lawsuit from them against Pocketpair, who is the Japanese indie developer behind Palworld, would eventually come in some shape or form. And then, of course, we didn't hear about it for a long time because it takes a while to build a case, right? And now there has been a joint press release that was released by Nintendo and the Pokemon Company filing a suit against them on the grounds of infringement of multiple patents, though, not copyright, right? So not trying to make the claim that Palworld infringes on their copyright on the characters of Pokemon, but rather that it copies game mechanics that Nintendo holds a patent for.
Which I didn't even realize they had any patents like this, and apparently Pocketpair didn't either. In their response, they said they were unaware of patents that it was accused of infringing, and are going to begin its own legal proceedings to investigate. Now, I don't know about you, Pete, but ignorance is not a defense in any case. You have to do your due diligence, and you should have checked that for these things before you released a very successful and very profitable game.
I think it would be also I would have more sympathy for their situation if they were not a Japanese company, because I know that the patent in question, right, which we'll discuss later. And if you're on YouTube, actually, I have a visual aid down below that you can see an image from the patent. Nintendo has a number of patents to like very specific gameplay, implementations, right? Like it could be something as simple as like the functionality of like how Amiibo works, right? With like communicating between that and a console. That's something that they might have a patent on. They have patents on controllers. They have patents on, all these different kinds of like things that are more specific. And I think you might imagine that they would have a patent on. But then there are also some others that are just kind of more general that apply to how like moment-to-moment gameplay plays out in one of their core franchises. And in the example here, it's actually the functionality of the Pokeball, right? Of like one of the core mechanics of your game being having a some kind of item, right? A ball that you can use to throw at a monster and capture it, and then at another time, release it for combat, right? And like that's the core mechanic that they have a patent for, and that is a full registered patent in Japan, but in other regions it's actually something that's still undergoing review. Like in the United States, they actually just had to resubmit an appeal back in August over this same patent. So it's not in effect in the U.S. yet, but it is in Japan, right? So if this was a developer in the States or Europe or, somewhere else in the world where they don't necessarily have the expectation of being able to, go and look up that information because they don't speak Japanese or they don't understand the intricacies of Japanese law, like, I think that in that case, I could see making a better case for the ignorance being not a defense but an explanation, right? Whereas, like, this is ostensibly, right, like, readily available information for them when they were seeking out to make this game, that they could have went and done that research or worked with a lawyer, right, to go and make sure that they weren't implementing anything that was going to specifically infringe on copyright and that they could get away with,
Which you'd have thought their publisher would have done, right? Like, isn't that the publisher's job to do those kind of things?
Aren't they self-published?
Are they?
I thought they were. So,
if they are, yes, it is published by themselves. This is why you partner up with the publisher, then.
Yeah.
To get someone to do this shit for you.
Or right, like, you would think, right, that maybe you take some of those that money that you make early on and then go and pursue that, right, when you heard that Nintendo was sniffing around. But I think it's one of those things that it's hindsight's 2020, right? They probably never expected the game to be such a massive success, and I think that we talked in the past, right, about the game, and I think when it comes to Nintendo's willingness to go after a smaller, company like this, it always has to do with, like, volume and the fact that Palworld was a massive success, that was breaking Steam records, that people were, favorably or unfavorably comparing it to Pokemon, that there was, merchandising efforts being made. Like, I think that's what is really the thing that ended up motivating them to go after them in this way, Yeah,
it's also possible that maybe they did look for some kind of patent when it first launched, because the patent that you've got linked looks like it was only granted in Japan in December of 2023, and they put the application in 2021. So it could be that, they started the development probably way before that, right? Maybe they started it before they even put the patent in 2021 and they weren't in realization that they were in violation. I'm kind of surprised that the patent has even been granted, and I hope the US does reject the appeal, because I do think it's a little bit far-reaching to say you can't throw an item at a character and have it capture that character. That seems a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth on stuff like this because, broadly speaking, like, I kind of agree with that sentiment, and, like, that's kind of like how Palworld responded, right? Like you said, that they in their initial statement they made the comment about being, like, unaware, but they also did, like, make a kind of, like, moralistic argument about it, right? Where they kind of position themselves as this underdog who's getting attacked by this multinational, huge corporation, and that threatens creativity. And I think that there is, a real I think that there's truth to that, right? That, like, something like this, setting this kind of legal precedent, can have a chilling effect and can create an environment where a company is afraid to make a Stardew Valley or a Palworld or whatever because, some video game company can say, well, we own farming games, or right?
Well, like, imagine if they'd have got granted a patent for Mario jumping and hitting a block or jumping on a character to kill it.
I think that's where I think the weeds of it get interesting for me, right? Because, like, again, I'm certainly no one to, like, want to go and jump in front of a bullet for a giant corporation like Nintendo, right? And I think that there is kind of a difference between, like, again, like the example I just gave, right? Where it's like farming is such a broad concept that, like, the idea that you could be like, no one else can make a farming game, or, like, no one else could make, like, a game about baseball, or nobody else could make a game about hunting or shooting, or, right, because it's like those are so broad in concept that,
it's, like, a genre. It's like I'm patenting horror,
and
that's,
no
one else can make a horror movie.
Exactly. And that's the thing, right, is that, like, I do think that and I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for Nintendo. I'm playing devil's advocate for the sake of the conversation, to forward the conversation, because I genuinely I don't know exactly how I feel about it yet. I think that there is a world of difference between saying you can't copy, like blatantly copy, the most iconic element of a franchise and like, you know, commercialize the fact that you're making a like gritty adult version with guns. And that, like, that is different than being like, we own the concept of a game where you capture creatures and make them fight, which is not something that they have ever tried to assert a patent over. And it's like, yeah, like, that's not a concept that Pokemon invented, and it's not a concept that they're claiming to own, right? But it's like, I do think the idea of being like, we're not talking about, you know, patenting Mario being able to run in 2D and jump and hit a block. We're talking about, like, you can't make no, I don't know, because that is mechanical, right? Huh.
Yeah, and it's the same thing as if, like, say, Minecraft was the only crafting game where I could put things together. Then Animal
but
Crossing,
crafting is
New
a broader
Horizons,
but crafting is broader to me. Right? Like, crafting is broader than the concept of throwing a Pokeball. Right? Like, I do think that there is something to be said about the idea that, like, that's not a super broad concept, right? Like, it's like the iconography, the mechanics of the Pokeball, the core, like, conceit of Pokemon, right, is like that kind of core mechanic. And that's something that, like, you know, I don't know, like, I guess I can see how that's distinct in a way that, like, I don't know, because I get here, I'm arguing against myself now. Palworld wouldn't be less successful as a game if it didn't feature the concept of a ball. So why is that important then? Right? I guess is the argument. Right? Because it's like the game apes Pokemon in a way that is legally distinct. I think we agree, right? And that, like, I think Nintendo and Pokemon Company agree with that they wouldn't win that legal battle, which is why they're not pursuing it, and they're pursuing this one as well. Because I think the ultimate takeaway here is that they don't like this game. So they're going through whatever rights they can to try to make it go away, or to cripple this company so that they can't grow at the rate that they would, or whatever, right? Like, they're trying to hurt and you know, ultimately dismantle Palworld. That's their you know, ideal outcome, I think, of this. Whether or not that's actually legally possible is something we can talk about in a minute, because I think there's a few different outcomes based on what I've seen from legal experts who understand law a lot better than you or I.
Well, definitely Japanese law. I don't know anything. I mean, I'm reading this patent and I'm trying to understand
like what it's specifically.
Some of it. A lot of it's in Japanese. Like, there's a lot of references to Ark as well. I don't know if you've seen that. Like, in the actual PDF patent, with links to YouTube videos and links to, like, the Stelladia Club website that shows, like, the tame toy in Ark. So I'm wondering, is Ark the next one on the list that needs to look out for this?
Yeah, I don't know. It remains to be seen, I guess. But yeah, it is. I think, interesting, because I guess the way I feel like I'm circling around this is that, like, I don't know that it doesn't make sense for you to be able to patent extremely specific ideas, but I do think that, like, I think when it comes to game mechanics, I think I'm with you. It gets really slippery fast.
Yeah, I really struggle with it. Like, specific, you should be able to hold copyright on design and characters and intellectual property in that way. I think the design of the Pokeball is very distinct. But when you get granted a patent that is throwing an item in 3D space at a character in order to trigger a battle, that to me is a little bit far reaching.
It's not that, though, right? It is specifically to battle a monster, capture it in a ball or a ball-like device, and then be able to recall it later for battle. It's not specifically throwing something to engage a battle. That's broad. I can see the argument that, like, those are distinct things, right? That there's a difference between, like, trying to copyright, like, genre or something broad like that versus a very specific idea. And I guess my question for you as a developer, right, like as somebody who, like, you develop code, why is it okay to copyright you use the word design, right? Well, game design is design. Like, if you came up with a system, you know, that is unique and it's never been used in a game before, and you create it, and it's unique to your game, you know, I'm not arguing that it's a good thing, right? Because I think about, like, the Nemesis system in that Lord of the Rings game that was, like, really cool, and everybody loved it, and they successfully got a patent for that idea, and now, like, there's been 2 games with that idea, and it's never gone anywhere else, and no one's ever been able to.
Yeah, and I really
think that's bad, right?
I don't know. I really hate it. I hate when simple conventions are done. I mean, the patent does go into a lot more detail. It's about switching between a first mode and a second mode.
It's extremely specific.
It is, yeah. So it's about, like, throwing a ball, capturing it, and then using that again in a second screen, that same character that you've caught. So it does make, in that case, I can understand that. But I always think about the most broad patent I can ever think of that was ever granted, which is the pull to refresh patent, which is owned by Twitter. Pull to refresh is just such a common gesture that everyone is aware of, and the fact that a company owns that gesture and can be like, you can't use that now, and could potentially use that to bully other companies just doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah,
and I think it doesn't. I can't imagine that Nintendo would have gone after Palworld for this if they hadn't ripped them off in every other way and trolled them and made it seem like Pokemon with guns and had been successful. Having said that, I don't like this kind of patent where it's a mechanic. I don't like software patents in general. I do think that they diminish creativity. I can't think of any other kind of medium. Music wouldn't exist if I could patent a specific chord and then you were no longer allowed to use it anymore. Sampling exists.
There are laws against sampling, though, right? And I would argue that they're bad. Then they limit creativity in a way that's negative, but they do exist.
But you can't say this one specific portion of this song is mine and no one else can ever use, you know, CDC or whatever chord anymore.
No, but that's different, right? Because that's where you get into the minutia of, like, the difference between broad, like, again, genre is you can't say, like, nobody can tell a scary story. I own scary stories, right? But you can say, like, nobody can tell stories about, you know, this specific thing that I've.
When the Sherlock Holmes copyright expired, we got tons of it.
Right. And it's like, I'm not advocating that that's, like, good or bad. I'm just saying that, like, to you know, play devil's advocate, why is this different than that? Why is one okay and one's not? And I think that, like, if we are saying that, like, it's not okay to, like, copyright the idea of, like, a funny cartoon character, but I can copyright Mickey Mouse, right? Like, why is the very extremely specific patent here of, like, you said, the iconic Pokeball, right? Like, why is it okay or not okay to, you know, make something that elicits, you know, I can't make a cartoon about a mouse that looks like Mickey Mouse without Disney coming after me if it reaches a certain level of acclaim, right? And it's like, I guess that's what's happening here. And it's, I mean, I would obviously, in a world where I'm in charge, the laws would work quite differently. But I mean, you know, if one of the possible outcomes here, right, if we look at legal precedent at what's happened in the past, because Nintendo has gone after companies for things like this before, there are examples of them having to essentially just pay a licensing fee, right, for using something that they created, right, and like using that patent to create something new. And I think that, you know, if that's the outcome, that doesn't seem all too dissimilar than how we've decided on law for sampling, for example, like you brought up, right? Like, you can't legally like to your point, say a chord progression belongs to you, but you can say that playing a certain chord progression in a certain way belongs to someone, and we do all the time. And if somebody illegally samples a song in another song and doesn't go and get licensing for that, they can be sued and end up in a situation where most of the money that they make...
They were like Uptown Funk all over again.
Or, there was a situation with... there's a hip-hop artist, I think their name is Juice WRLD, who sampled a song by The Police, and they didn't go through the proper channels of getting a license to do that. And then, Sting sued them and joked about how he's like, oh yeah, I've never heard the song, but it paid for my kid to go to college. And it's like, that sucks. That sucks, because I would argue that taking a song, because they didn't even sample the song, they interpolated the song, which is when you take a well-known musical pattern or idea and then recreate it and play it in a different way. So you're not even sampling it.
Exactly. That's probably more like what this is. This is more interpolation, if we're going to say.
Exactly.
If we're going to put it in those terms.
And there are tons of laws about that. There are tons of laws that you're not allowed to do that with music. You brought up another court case about a song that was sued for quote unquote copying, borrowing, building on another song's ideas and structure and a familiar hook and then making something new. And I would argue that that meets the legal requirement of being quote unquote transformative, right? Which is supposed to be a legal defense for, creative acts of utilizing another copyright holder's work. But we have tons of laws that many of which I would argue are racist, that exist to limit people's ability to do that. And
that's in the US. I mean, we're not familiar with Japanese law at all. It could be that that's not even a defense here, that you can have a derivative work or transformative work, and that's a reasonable defense.
Totally, yeah, it's a great point.
I mean, this patent specifically around Legends Arceus and firing a ball in kind of the open world and then going into a battle once you've thrown the ball. That's what the patent's about.
Right.
You got to think that there's a way that Palworld could just modify their game somewhat, get rid of the ball, have it where you just walk up to the monster and start a fight instead.
So I want to
change it and tweak it.
Yeah, I want to share some thoughts here from some legal experts. So Haley McLean or McLean or McLean, it could be any of those. Sorry, Katie. Or Haley, excuse me. I literally, as I was about to read your name a second time, my cat Lucas walked directly in front of the screen. So apologize double there, Haley. So Haley McLean from the Voyer Law firm said that one of the kind of outcomes that could happen here is Palworld just making changes, undergoing large changes to the fundamental way that you battle, capture, and then utilize pals later on, which, that could easily be one of the ways that this plays out. She said, for Japan and a lot of other jurisdictions too, patent infringement is the unauthorized commercial workings of a third party of a claimed invention. The scope of whatever is protected under the patent determines the consideration for whether an act constitutes infringement against said scope. There's both direct infringement and indirect infringement as well. Without getting overly complicated, Nintendo has to prove that Pocketpair's commercial actions infringed on their patents and that they did not give them consent to do so. And then she kind of goes into a few of the ways that this could ultimately affect Palworld materially, right? Which is that they could be not allowed to release the game in certain markets or jurisdictions, as she puts it. Pocketpair may have to pay licensing fees, and then getting to keep any and then that would allow them to keep any of those infringing mechanics, so they wouldn't have to make any changes to the gameplay. They would just owe Nintendo a licensing fee. And then the other one would be having to completely remove those patented mechanics and then relaunch the game, and that would lead to and this could happen either because of that or just because of the law, right? Having quote-unquote injunction periods where the game has to be removed from all storefronts while they're litigating whether or not it's legal for it to be sold.
Yeah, I mean, If they've only got the patent granted in Japan, which it seems like they have, it's still
Right.
awaiting an appeal in the US. The EU's not looked at it yet. They could just remove it from sale in Japan, but considering they're a Japanese company and considering the theme of the game, I imagine that's probably a popular market for them.
Well, they might just be forced to cede operating in Japan for a while too, right? Like while they litigate this
that'll be
case.
the injunction period, I
Right.
guess, where they have to take it off the store in Japan. And then maybe they do go away and they just make adjustments to it. It could just be that it's very minor adjustments. I would imagine, though, there's probably more to this because Nintendo cited patents, plural,
Right.
in their press release. This is the only patent that people have found and have brought up. But there's probably a lot more behind the scenes, and I can imagine this would open the doors to potentially a further case of, well, you clearly did steal game character designs. They look a lot like Pikachu.
Yeah, right. Once you open that door, then it's maybe easier to like when you've proved that they've infringed on your mechanical patent, then it's probably easier to make an argument that they also stole your copyright, right? That they infringed on your because it's like, look, clearly this game it only had the success it had because it infringes on our copyright. That's the legal argument that they want to make. And I mean, that's where it gets interesting to me because I think that's true. And not specifically the ball, not specifically that,
think it is.
but it's like I do think that I mean I can you at least agree with me that like Palworld is successful because of the way that it is similar to Pokemon,
Yes,
right?
it's a Pokemon clone, but I don't necessarily think it's successful because they stole anyone's copyright. That needs to be proven to be the case. You can make characters look similar, right? There are lots of characters that look similar to Mickey Mouse. There are lots of characters
Sure.
that look similar to Mario that they don't infringe upon copyright. You can make characters.
I mean, there's plenty of Pokemon clones out there that are indie games that have not received this level of attention and have not.
Yeah, what was the one that you played last year that you really liked? It was like that multiplayer one.
Was that last year?
I think so.
Maybe
in the year before.
Temtem? Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah, Temtem. Yeah.
There you go. I don't know that I don't remember there being balls being thrown. Which there you go, right? Like that's the difference. Like cuz it's like they don't own the concept of like you having monster friends that fight. Like that's
No, they don't. And
they
can't.
Don't
have
like
on turn-based combat.
No, nothing, none of that. And so I don't know. I guess that's the interesting thing is like it's not so much that like Palworld could only be successful by infringing on Pokemon's copyright, but it does only have its popularity because it apes Pokemon,
which
so
is
like
the same as Temtem,
right? And the difference there is, I guess, that it was less successful, right? Like it's like is that
and you could say that Stardew Valley is only popular because it's a Harvest Moon clone.
See, and that I would disagree with though, because I think the difference there is that game became popular because it filled a gap that those games were no longer filling, and I think that there is probably a very large percentage of players of Stardew Valley that have never played Harvest Moon, right?
Heard of it?
Yeah, because it's too old. It's an old game that they don't have any familiarity with. Whereas like Pokemon is literally the largest entertainment franchise in the world, and they got a not insignificant amount of attention by being like, look how much this looks like they're ripping off Pokemon. Now, Wooloo, that Pokemon that you just met in Sword and Shield, here it is with a gun in its hand. That was the marketing. And it's like, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be able to do that, but it's like, I mean, it is fairly blatant, and
how many articles were there where the headline was "It's Pokemon with guns"? Right after that first original trailer,
right?
We thought it looked like that. I remember us watching it. I think we were watching it live, and we were laughing at how much it was like Pokemon with guns.
How much some of the designs are just like, holy shit, that just looks like this Pokemon, right? Like,
yeah.
So it's like I think that's, and
I could understand it if they went after that. Like if they did their research, they did their investigation, they found out that the 3D models had been completely ripped off and that they had taken their work and modified it rather than creating their own 3D models from scratch. I could understand that legal argument, and that's, I think, the legal argument everyone expected. Not for them to come out of seemingly nowhere and just say, "Oh yeah, by the way, we have this patent that was granted in 2023 that covers the Pokemon Legends Arceus
And I think that's the thing, whereas
concept."
they think it's because they can win this and they wouldn't win the other one, right? Which, for whatever reason, which, I think is interesting, because I mean, I think that's a big part of why this is so unpopular, right? And why so many people are I think, rightly upset that, like, Nintendo's a bully, right? And they are this big, huge company that goes after the little guy and,
Now you're sounding like
is content to bleed them out of business, right?
now you're sounding like the Palworld team.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they said, right? More or less, in not so many words. But, I had another quote here from Haley that I thought was interesting, where, she said that kind of there's the obvious benefit, right, of, like, if they pursue this case and they win, they can, take out or deal damage to this other game that they view as being, either whether because they legitimately believe that it infringes on their copyright or because they think that it, is embarrassing and they want it to go away, right? They don't want this, game out there making fun of them that is breaking records on these platforms that they're not on. And, like I if they're just pissed off about it, right? And the kind of point that she's making is that the other benefit of this is trying to establish a legal precedent and creating a chilling effect, right? She said Nintendo would also be viewing enforcements like this as a sort of investment in imposing an unspoken fear of retribution in the marketplace for other companies, as in, look at what we did to this guy. Don't cross us and we won't do it to you too. Even if they don't intend to enforce these patents ever again, the fear would still be there to deter other companies.
It's a Gary Bowser situation. It's like, hey, you want to run a ROM site or you want to run some kind of hacking tool, then we're going to come after you. You might end up in prison. You may end up with a massive amount of fine, with us garnishing your wages for the rest of your life, And they've done it time and time again. It really is unsurprising to see. We spoke only a few weeks ago about them going after someone else, and I'm not surprised that they decided to go after Palworld. I think we kind of figured they would when they put out the end of press release earlier this year that they were looking into it, when everyone was blowing up on Twitter and trying to show evidence that they'd stolen designs. I think it's just the case here. Does it really matter if they're going after this guy after these guys just for wanting to get out of the market if they still have violated a patent? No, it doesn't. They're still going to get taken down. They're still going to have to follow the law of any country that they choose to sell their product in. It may just end up, though, that this patent doesn't get granted anywhere else and people just can't release this kind of game in Japan. Or they just go ahead and take the ball out or take the throw-in mechanic out and go down some different avenue.
Yeah, and I think, it's not unreasonable to think that they could do that, right? That, like, they could take the time to, even if they have to go off the market in Japan or wherever else for some amount of time, that they could go away, make those adjustments, and then re-release the game, and it's kind of business as usual, and it ultimately doesn't really matter that much. But, I mean, I guess it depends on how much the court decides that they have infringed on that copyright, right? Because, like, if they
may not even get to court, right? It might not get to that phase.
That's true.
It might be that they settle beforehand, which they've done, as you said, with another company in 2021.
And that ended up being a situation where they just had to pay a licensing fee and they just continued to use the same technology as they had been.
I mean, which I hate that. There's not even any technology here. It's just you're throwing a ball into through a different screen. This patent really annoys me, Pete, if you haven't noticed.
No, I get that. I really do. And I think ultimately, yeah, I feel like it's one of those situations where Nintendo is a large, aggressive, like legally aggressive corporation, and it behooves them to take this action. And it is something that I think most people, right, like, are going to have a certain level of, or I guess at least most people in the West, you know, based on our cultural attitudes, right? Like, I'm not going to speak for, you know, how other folks would interpret it, but I think that it leaves this bad taste of like, you're this big bully picking on this other company, and instead of making a better game, you went after them legally, right? I think that's the popular narrative here. And that's how a lot of gamers are gonna interpret this, right? And that's
I presume it's the same as any copyright law and any trademark law. I'm not familiar with patents, but you have to defend them, right? You have to defend your trademark or you lose it. And I would imagine if they didn't defend their patent, it could be lost, and they're not going to want that to happen. As it stands, this doesn't expire until 2041. So if this is proven that Palworld did violate this patent, which it probably will, because they seemingly have, then nobody else can make this game until 2041 unless they pay Nintendo billions of yen.
Well, and then at that point, they'll probably apply to, you know, extend the patent and keep it going, right? Like, it's like, that's how it works in the West anyway, or in America, I should say, anyway. That, you know, like famously, right? Disney has changed copyright law dozens of times to maintain their copyright on Mickey Mouse. So it's, you know, it's as long as it is until you decide you want to keep it going, and then you pay a bunch of money to change the law.
Yeah, the Cliff Richards, the change of copyright law in this country. He kept having to move his extension on his copyright of his songs because the man just lives forever. Has been making music for like 70 years.
It's like, this is bullshit. I'm still alive. You can't. Well, that's how it works here, right? It's like it's until death and then plus a certain amount of time, and they just keep extending that every time Walt Disney has another milestone birthday.
Oh, okay.
But that's really why, like, Steamboat Willie, like, finally entered the public domain because they couldn't extend it again.
Good.
Yep.
Quite right.
Totally. Right. Exactly. And that's the thing, right? It's like, it's not like it hurt Disney, right? Like, it didn't, they can't not use it now, right? It's just other people are using it in ways that are, you know, subversive and ways that they might find questionable and, like, tough shit, right? Like, that's how it should be. At least that's how we think it should be, right? It seems like you and I are in agreement on that.
I don't like seeing creativity being, like, punched down. And I feel like this kind of thing only seeks to do that. You know, I don't know that anyone really thought the mechanic in Pokemon Legends Arceus was revolutionary and a new invention, which is what patents are for. They're for inventions. I don't think we saw it that way. I don't think anyone that played that game thought this was breaking new ground. And that's seemingly what Nintendo thought when they filed this patent. And I just can't see it. I can't see how this was granted. I can see why it was initially rejected by the US Patent Office, and then Nintendo had to appeal it. I don't know what their appeal is. It may go through, but it just feels like it's so derivative on previous games and previous artwork that I don't really understand. I don't really understand how you can patent something so simple.
See, like, that's interesting to me, though, because you can patent things that are extremely simple, right? Like, I don't know, like Walt Disney owns a patent, or I guess the company now, right, owns a patent for, like, the hinge that pushes in on a trash can so that you can push in and put trash in a trash can and not get your hands dirty and, like, not have an open trash can. Like, he invented that idea, and they hold that patent. Like, that's a simple idea. You know, how is that different than
simple ideas? Yeah, I guess it's really difficult. I feel like
I know, and that's the thing is, like,
I feel like it's one of those you just know it when you see it, right?
Sure,
it's like the definition of porn. But you just know it when you see it.
But that's why you have to go to court over shit like this, then, right? Because it's like who knows it when they see it? Because to a lot of people, Palworld is obviously violating the copyright, right? It's an infringement on their copyright by your metrics, by creative standards, by, you know, copying character designs and things like that.
See, I don't know that is an infringement. They're not unless they have specifically copied and pasted it.
My point is that to a lot of people, it clearly is that. And the fact that some people will interpret it clearly as copying, and other people will be like, that's absolutely ridiculous. Like how, the negative effect of saying that this is that far outweighs any amount of actual copying that went on here, right? Like, and those are the two sides of this argument, right? And it's like, personally, like I am with you, or like I would rather take a very extreme point of view on copyright law, where like I would rather there be no ability for a company to exert control over a character or a piece of music or anything like that, that no entity should be able to do that, rather than say that we have these kinds of limitations. But I think that that's a radical point of view, right? I think a lot of people...
I'm not saying nothing. Like, I do think people...
Where do you draw the line, though? That's the tough part.
I mean, they already came up with something cool. They already packaged it together. It's already the most popular entertainment franchise on the planet. Did you really need to copyright Throwing a Ball? Did you really need to patent that? Like, is that something that is a new invention that is gonna really protect you from people making the same kind of game?
But I mean, I guess the question is, and again, like, I just want to be really clear that I am trying to have this conversation.
He really loves Nintendo.
I'm not trying to advocate for Nintendo bullying a smaller company.
Wants them to squash everyone.
It's not the case. However, I think that there is a interesting conversation here, because I think that what you're talking about, right, is that like you don't want these kinds of patents to limit creativity, right, or to
I don't
limit
like software patents in general. I really hate them.
Sure. But that's, I guess, where it gets interesting, right? Because it's like, why is software as an intellectual property different than a piece of art or a piece of music or a book or something like that? And I think
it's its culture. Like, software for me, the Switch wouldn't exist. That game probably wouldn't have been built if it wasn't for open source software that people built and was just like, okay, you can license it for free. They could have copyrighted that. They could have been like, well, you're not using any of it. But they didn't. But
again, and to press that point of view, why should that be different than the culture that we treat other ideas for? Because I think that, again, I think I agree with you. It sounds to me like it's, I do agree that software development and users and like the creativity of better software is at odds with patents for software ideas. I would argue that is probably largely true for a lot of things, though, and that like maybe patents shouldn't exist at all. But then in the same breath,
you've only got to look at like medicine, right?
Right.
Medical patents.
But then in the same breath, there are also dozens of examples of someone creating an idea and then an evil corporation, stealing it from them and profiting off of it. And like, where do you draw the line of like, being able to limit how someone uses your ideas? And I
don't know. I really don't know.
It's complex.
That's for the patent office to decide whether they're too reaching or not. And obviously Japan decided that this patent wasn't. The US patent office rejected it. We're going to have to see if it gets granted in the US, in the EU, in Australia, in the UK, and other patent offices around the world. But man, it just, I don't know, it's tough. And like I mentioned the pull to refresh thing. I do remember when that first came out, and it was like, yeah, that did seem like, wow, this seems so simple, but why did no one do this before? Like, it seems like,
yeah, if it's so simple, then why didn't you come up with it? And why does the person who came up with it not deserve to be able
some kind of compensation,
to benefit financially from that idea, right? And that's where it gets, and then again, right, it's like, but it's not a person, it's a giant multi-million-dollar corporation that the person sold the idea to, or they worked there when they had the idea, and now
where they were,
and and what now? Well, and in the case of Nintendo, right, with Pokemon, like to be fair, Pokemon wouldn't exist without Nintendo, right? They came in and gave them an influx of cash and allowed them to finish the game and gave them development support. So, like, it wouldn't exist without Nintendo. So, like, do they not deserve some stake in that? You know, it's like that's where this all gets so dicey, because I think that there's
poor Game Freak. They're not even named as an assignee on the patent. It's Nintendo Company Limited and Pokemon Company.
Well, I think that is that's like the nature of the fact that the Pokemon Company exists. Like, the Pokemon Company was created to manage the fact that Pokemon became a multi...
Yeah, but why is Nintendo specifically named then?
Because Nintendo has vested interest in the creation of Pokemon, right? Like, they spent money to make sure Pokemon got made. And therefore, they own a stake of it forever. That's just how their agreement works. They own 50% of the Pokemon Company, I believe. I think that's how
what's the split between creatures and Game Freak these days?
Oh, I have no idea. I couldn't tell you. Because that's the thing. Is like
seemingly missing out of the equation these days.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like it
was a cool idea to be a part of back in the beginning. Now you just sit back and read.
Yeah, I mean, like, they were important in the beginning. You know, like, that's true.
They
like,
made Detective Pikachu.
They were Ape back in the day, right? And it's like the Earthbound studio. Like, they were instrumental in getting the game made in the first place, but, it's like, and that's the whole thing, right? Is like, when you're talking about, like, franchises and stuff that exist far beyond the person, like, Pokemon will exist for 200 years past the death of more probably than every person involved in making it, right? Like, it'll probably exist for as long as there's people, who knows, right? It's got no signs of slowing down. So it's just like, it's the same thing with, like, Mickey Mouse, right? We were just talking about that, where it's like, that character will eclipse the people that made it what it was dozens and dozens and thousands of times over, right? So it's like, I'm inclined to think that the probably the sweet spot is a world where when the person that made the thing is still alive, they can control it, and then after that point, maybe that's it, because I don't know how you control it ethically beyond that.
It's difficult when the patent's not granted to a person; it's granted to a corporation.
Well, and that's the whole problem with that, right? Is that corporations have the powers of people; they can hold things like that forever.
Yeah,
so
like, can a corporation really invent something? I don't think so. I think, and I know on U.S. patents, people are named. Doesn't seem to be the case on the Japanese patent.
Well, and it's like, that's a very controversial topic, right? Like, that's something that, like, you see a lot in the world of, like superheroes, right? Like, there's, like, these characters that are making millions and millions of dollars in these movies or whatever, and people that created them working for Marvel and DC as, like, work for hire, right? Like, they don't.
Oh yeah, I remember.
They don't see a portion of that money.
Well, did you see the, like, Into the Spider-Verse and how Sony was trying to, like, patent or copyright that animation style, and it's just like, well, what about the artists that came up with it? What do they get?
Yeah.
Nothing,
because they were work for hire, right? It's like, they own that, and it's like, I obviously don't agree with that, right? But then it's like, there are examples of, like, artists who, like, will, like, sue a politician for using their music because they don't want them to use their music as a campaign slogan.
Celine Dion and JD Vance, yeah.
And it's like, you would, it's like, I feel like, ethically, right? Like, I do think that you as an artist should be able to be like, no, like, I don't want you to be able to use my song as, like, an anthem for, like, a campaign rooted in hate. And I do think that, like, it becomes extremely difficult to say we can litigate the way ideas are used sometimes and not other times. And that gray area is why copyright is as nebulous as it is, and why there are some examples where it's like, clearly this is not okay, right? But it is, it is decided that it is. And then there are other examples where it's like, why isn't this okay? And the answer is, like, a more complicated social issue than what it is, right? Because I would argue that the legal reason that sampling is treated differently than some of these other things, right? The interpolation example that we brought up is because racist old white dudes don't like hip hop, and they didn't like that, songs were getting sampled, and they wanted to damage the culture, as you described, of doing that, right? And that's what they did. And I would argue that was not, ethically right and was not in the spirit of copyright and not actually in the spirit of how the law was written. But here we are. It's legal precedent, and now that's what we're dealing with. And I think to put a period on this long fucking sentence, I understand your aversion and your anger, and you're like, I don't want any level of software to be patented, because that's where you get this, right? Where you're going to live in a world where every little idea you're paying a nickel to somebody else, right? And then it's like, where does that leave us? Where does that leave the advancement of software? Where does that leave the advancement of the arts, right? And I mean, I would argue in a pretty bleak place, and that's where we are today, right?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm interested to see how this plays out. Presumably, we'll see the actual filing at some point, because they said they are going to file, but we've not seen that yet. And then I guess it's going to be battled in court or settled out of court for a fee or for some kind of
and this will be years, right? Like, we won't know for a long time is the thing. Like, there will be dozens of updates on this before we actually
is anyone
know.
going to give a shit about Palworld?
Who knows? Probably not. And honestly, that's probably part of Nintendo's intention, is that if they can do this now, they squash merch and adaptations and any of the things that would continue to breathe lifeblood into the IP, and they'll have it die on the vine. And it'll be a flash in the pan thing that came out and it went away, and then we moved on from it. And Pokemon will keep on trucking. And that's, I'm sure, what they want.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're probably right there, which is a shame.
But let us know what you think of the issue, dear listener. I'm very interested in hearing how the community feels about it. I do think that I think probably largely on the same page. I haven't seen many people coming out to the defense of Nintendo on this one. But, if you passionately feel like they are in the right, I'm interested in hearing that opinion. And let's have a nice dialogue about it in the Discord this week, and just keep it respectful, right? Let's discuss this in a way that's fun and level-headed, like Steve and I did here today, right? We don't need to argue. So, folks, if you want to come keep that conversation rolling on the Discord, if you want to hear the rest of our slate of sister shows, including the Flip Screen Games podcast, we're going to be talking about PlayStation's latest state of play, or the Steam Deck podcast, where there's a non-zero chance we'll talk about this again. Who's to say? Who knows what'll happen in a few more days? But go check those things out. We have a bunch of conversations about what's going on in the rest of the world of video games outside of Nintendo. And if you enjoy this show, I'm sure you'll enjoy those too. However you choose to get involved, flipscreen.games is the website where you can find everywhere we are, all over the web, all the ways you can get involved or show your support. You'll find them right there. And we appreciate whichever one you choose to do, however you choose to get involved. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a part of the conversation. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Nintendo Noise. Oh, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. We'll see you next week.